a legal dynasty, and the night Moselle fell silent in the low country of South Carolina. There is an unspoken rule that never appears in law books, but is universally understood. Justice does not live only in statutes. It lives in relationships, in favors quietly returned, in handshakes behind closed doors, and in families whose influence is so deeply rooted that the system bends without appearing to move. For nearly a century, one name stood at the center of that order: the Murdaugh family. For 3 generations, the Murdaughs controlled the prosecutor's office in South Carolina's 14th Judicial Circuit. They decided who was charged. They decided how cases moved forward. And, just as importantly, which cases never went anywhere at all. In small southern communities, power does not need to announce itself. It survives through silence, familiarity, and fear. No one believed that dynasty could ever collapse until the night of June 7, 2021. Moselle was a sprawling hunting estate, hundreds of acres of woods and dirt roads tucked away in Colleton County. No security gates, no perimeter cameras watching every angle, just land, firearms, and isolation. It belonged to Alex Murdaugh, the heir apparent to the family's legal empire. Shortly after 10 p.m., Alex Murdaugh called 911. His voice shook. His words came out uneven. He told the dispatcher that he had just returned to Moselle and found his wife and son shot to death near the dog kennels behind the house. The victims were Maggie Murdaugh, 52 years old, and Paul Murdaugh, 22. From the very beginning, the scene raised more questions than answers. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of robbery, no reports of strangers entering or leaving the property. In an area where every road and every truck was familiar, the idea that an outsider could enter Moselle, commit a double murder, and disappear without a trace seemed unlikely. Then investigators noticed something else. Paul had been killed with a shotgun, fired at close range. Maggie had been shot with a rifle while running away. 2 weapons, 2 moments, 2 deliberate choices. This was not a crime of impulse. It was controlled, executed by someone comfortable with firearms, familiar with the property, and most importantly, aware of exactly who would be there that night. Paul Murdaugh, a name already known Paul Murdaugh, was not an unknown figure before his death. In 2019, he was involved in a late-night boat crash while allegedly intoxicated. A young woman, Mallory Beach, was killed. The case ignited public anger, and many believed the Murdaugh name had shielded Paul from immediate accountability. But this time, the consequences could not be quietly managed. Mallory Beach's family filed a civil lawsuit seeking millions of dollars in damages. That lawsuit threatened not just Alex Murdaugh's finances, but the carefully maintained image of the family itself. What almost no one knew at the time was that Alex Murdaugh was already standing on the edge of collapse. The cracks behind the image to the outside world, Alex appeared successful and secure, a respected attorney, a man with land, money, and connections. But behind the scenes, his law firm had begun to notice something troubling. Client settlement funds were missing. Payments that should have gone to vulnerable clients, injury victims, families who had lost loved ones were nowhere to be found. An internal investigation was forming, and Alex knew it. If those numbers were exposed, everything would end. His career, his reputation, the dynasty that had protected his family for generations. Maggie Murdaugh, according to friends, had begun to sense something was wrong. She was living away from Moselle, asking questions about money, pulling away from a marriage that no longer felt stable. In many family homicide cases, Investigators pay close attention to one detail: who knows too much at the most dangerous moment. Maggie may have been that person. A story that sounded right. Alex told investigators that night that he had eaten dinner with Maggie and Paul, then left Moselle to visit his ailing mother. He said he was not present at the kennels when the shootings occurred. He returned later and discovered the bodies. At first glance, the story seemed plausible. There were no witnesses contradicting him, no cameras capturing his movements. But seasoned investigators knew better than to rely on a narrative, especially when power had shaped truth in this community for decades. This case would not be decided by what someone said. It would be decided by what data revealed. And data, piece by piece, was already beginning to dismantle a story Alex Murdaugh had spent his entire life learning how to control. When the data started talking in every modern homicide investigation, there is a moment when instinct gives way to numbers, when reputation stops mattering, when authority loses its edge. The case no longer belongs to witnesses or words, but to timestamps, signals, and cold digital trails. For the Murdaugh murders, that moment arrived quietly and far sooner than anyone expected. From the start, investigators understood they were dealing with an unusual scene. The man who called 911 was not just a grieving husband. He was Alex Murdaugh, a veteran trial lawyer who knew exactly how police reports were written, how timelines were constructed, and how doubt was introduced. Alex's initial statement was controlled and efficient. He said he had dinner with his wife Maggie Murdaugh and their son Paul Murdaugh, then left Moselle to visit his ailing mother. He insisted he was not present at the dog kennels when the shootings occurred. When he returned, he said, everything was already over. On paper, it worked. No eyewitness contradicted him. No surveillance camera showed otherwise. In a rural property spread across hundreds of acres, absence can be easy to claim. But something about this case was different. Paul Murdaugh was 22 years old. Like most people his age, his phone rarely left his hand, and that device would soon rewrite the entire investigation. Building the digital timeline, investigators began reconstructing the evening minute by minute. They pulled call logs, GPS pings, step counts, screen activations, text messages, and media files. Individually, these data points meant very little. Together they formed a map that could not be argued with. Paul's phone showed normal activity deep into the evening. He sent messages. He moved around the property. He filmed short videos. There was no indication of fear, no frantic calls, no attempt to escape or summon help. In homicide work, that absence matters. It suggests trust. It suggests the victim did not perceive danger from the person closest to him. Then investigators discovered a short video recorded at the dog kennels just minutes before Paul's phone went silent. The Snapchat video, the video itself, was unremarkable. Dogs barking, dim light, routine movement. It lasted less than a minute and was never meant to be evidence of anything at all. But when investigators played the audio, the room went still. In the background, behind the noise of the kennels, was a man's voice, calm, familiar, close. It was Alex Murdaugh, not distant, not passing by. Present, the implication was immediate and devastating. Alex had told police he was not at the kennels at that time, yet his voice was there, captured accidentally, preserved without intent or bias. This was not a witness who could be discredited. It was not a memory that could fade. It was data. And data does not forget. A collision with reality. From that moment on, the investigation shifted, quietly but permanently. Investigators did not confront Alex immediately. They continued gathering information. They compared the Snapchat audio to known recordings of his voice. They aligned it with phone movements and vehicle data. Each comparison led to the same conclusion. Alex Murdaugh had been at the kennels minutes before his wife and son were killed. That single contradiction between what Alex said and what the data showed changed everything. In criminal investigations, there is a clear dividing line. Before it, a person is treated as a witness. After it, they are treated as a subject. Alex crossed that line without knowing it. Paul's final moments, Paul's phone activity ended abruptly. There was no drawn-out struggle, no prolonged attempt to flee. The forensic evidence later confirmed what the data suggested. He was shot at extremely close range with a shotgun, the kind of wound that offers no chance to react. To investigators, this reinforced a critical point. Paul did not see the attack coming. He did not sense a threat. He did not believe he was in danger in the place where he stood or from the person nearby. That level of surprise is rarely present when a victim encounters a stranger. Maggie's phone told a different story. Her data showed movement steps, directional changes, a brief attempt to get away. She was shot while running, struck from behind. There was no evidence of a prolonged argument, no signs of a heated confrontation. The shootings unfolded quickly, decisively, and without hesitation. The killer did not panic. He did not miss. He did not linger. That level of control suggested familiarity, not just with the property, but with the people. The story begins to change when investigators eventually confronted Alex with the digital evidence. His certainty wavered. He no longer insisted he had never been near the kennels. Instead, he said he could not remember exactly where he had been or when. He blamed shock, grief, his long-standing drug addiction. To seasoned investigators, this pattern was familiar. Innocent people tend to remember the last moments they spent with loved ones in sharp detail. Guilty people often begin to forget selectively. Alex's account shifted, not once, but repeatedly. Each adjustment narrowed his options. Power meets process for weeks. The investigation carried an unspoken tension. Alex Murdaugh was not just any suspect. His family had prosecuted cases in this region for generations. He knew many of the officers. He understood the system from the inside. But this time, the case did not belong to relationships. As the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division took a more prominent role, local familiarity was stripped away. Evidence was reviewed independently. Assumptions were discarded. No explanation was accepted without data to support it. For the first time in decades, the Murdaugh name stopped functioning as protection. It became a liability. The point of no return. By the end of this phase, investigators had reached a quiet consensus. There was no evidence of intruders, no signs of a targeted revenge attack by outsiders, no digital footprint of unknown suspects entering or leaving Moselle. There was only one person whose story did not align with the facts: the man who had discovered the bodies, the man whose voice appeared in the final video, the man who insisted, then retreated when confronted with proof. But data alone does not send someone to prison. To build a murder case, prosecutors needed more than presence and contradiction. They needed motive, and the motive was buried not in emotion, but in money-hidden transactions, stolen trust, and a financial collapse already underway long before a single shot was fired. That is where the case truly began to come apart. For years, Alex Murdaugh appeared to live the life of a successful Southern attorney. He owned property. He hosted hunting weekends. He moved comfortably through courtrooms and community events alike. To neighbors and colleagues, the money seemed endless. It was not. Behind the image, A second life was quietly unraveling, one built on missing funds, fabricated accounts, and a system designed to exploit trust without triggering alarms. By the time Maggie and Paul were killed, that system was already collapsing. The mechanics of the fraud when investigators began tracing Alex's finances. They did not find a single reckless theft. They found a pattern, precise, repetitive, and deliberate. Settlement checks meant for clients were diverted into accounts with deceptively similar names. Transfers moved through intermediaries who did not ask questions. Local banking relationships built over years of familiarity, smooth transactions that should have raised red flags. In some cases, Alex acted as both attorney and gatekeeper, controlling when clients were paid and how their funds were routed. The victims were not corporations with compliance departments. They were people, at their most vulnerable, those injured in accidents, families who had lost loved ones. They trusted the lawyer whose name had long been synonymous with authority. That trust was the engine of the fraud. As auditors would later determine, the scheme had been running for years. The amounts grew, the risks compounded, and eventually the numbers could no longer be reconciled quietly. The pressure builds by early 2021. Alex's law firm began asking questions. Internal reviews revealed discrepancies too large to ignore. Meetings were scheduled. Explanations were requested. Deadlines were set. At the same time, the civil lawsuit stemming from Paul's 2019 boat crash was advancing. Discovery demands threatened to expose Alex's personal finances to outside scrutiny, bank records, asset disclosures, cash flows. The walls were closing in from both sides. For the first time in his life, Alex Murdaugh faced a reality he could not negotiate away. Exposure was imminent. Addiction as accelerant as investigators dug deeper. They uncovered another destabilizing force: long-term opioid addiction, not recreational use, dependence. According to records and testimony, Alex was spending staggering sums on pills, tens of thousands of dollars per week. Addiction did not create the fraud, but it magnified the fear of discovery. It distorted judgment. It compressed time. Problems that might have seemed survivable a year earlier now felt catastrophic. In many family homicide cases, addiction functions as an accelerant. It does not provide motive on its own. It amplifies desperation until extreme actions feel rational. By June 2021, Alex Murdaugh was not thinking in terms of solutions. He was thinking in terms of delay. Delay as strategy from an investigative perspective. The murders at Moselle accomplished one thing immediately. Everything stopped. The civil case paused. Financial scrutiny slowed. Questions were deferred. Sympathy replaced suspicion. For a brief window, Alex Murdaugh was no longer a lawyer under investigation. He was a grieving husband and father. In that window, time, his most precious commodity, was restored. Prosecutors would later argue that this was not coincidence. It was calculation. The roadside shooting 3 months after the murders. Just as scrutiny began creeping back, another event thrust Alex into the center of a new narrative. In September 2021, he was found on the side of a rural road in Hampton County, bleeding from a head wound. He claimed he had been shot by an unknown assailant while changing a tire. The story immediately drew national attention. If true, it suggested a campaign of violence against the Murdaugh family. But the story did not hold. Cell phone data contradicted key details. Witness accounts raised doubts, and soon investigators identified the man who fired the shot, Curtis Eddie Smith, a longtime acquaintance. This was not an assassination attempt. It was staged. The insurance plot, according to evidence and later admissions, Alex had arranged the shooting himself. The plan was chilling in its simplicity. If he died, A life insurance policy would pay out millions to his surviving son. The shooting was meant to look fatal. It failed. Alex survived. Smith cooperated, and with that cooperation, the final illusion collapsed. For investigators, the roadside incident answered a critical question. It demonstrated that Alex Murdaugh was willing to orchestrate violence, including against himself, to manipulate outcomes. It showed intent, planning, and a willingness to exploit tragedy for financial relief that mattered. The domino effect: after the staged shooting, investigations multiplied. State and federal authorities coordinated. Financial records were subpoenaed. Old cases were reopened. The scope of Alex's conduct expanded far beyond Moselle. What emerged was not a man trapped by circumstance, but a man who had repeatedly chosen deception as a solution until deception no longer worked. From a prosecutorial standpoint, the picture was now complete. A financial collapse underway. A civil case threatening exposure, an addiction accelerating fear, a family positioned, in his mind, as both liability and shield, and a pattern of behavior showing he would do almost anything to buy time. Connecting motive to murder, the murders at Moselle were no longer isolated acts of violence. They were the central event in a broader narrative of control slipping away. Prosecutors did not need to argue that Alex hated his wife or son. They argued something colder and far more persuasive to a jury. They argued that Alex believed the deaths would pause the reckoning. And for a short time, they did. The case turns toward court. By the end of this phase, investigators were no longer assembling possibilities. They were preparing a case. Presence had been established. Contradictions documented. Motive articulated. Intent demonstrated through subsequent actions. The final arena would not be Moselle or a roadside shoulder. It would be a courtroom. There, the power that once defined the Murdaugh name would be tested against evidence that could not be persuaded, delayed, or silenced. Inside the courtroom, when power faced proof. For nearly a century, the Murdaugh name carried authority in South Carolina courtrooms. It was spoken with familiarity, sometimes with deference. Judges knew it. Prosecutors respected it. Jurors recognized it. In January 2023, that history followed Alex Murdaugh into a courtroom. Only this time, it offered no protection. He was no longer standing at counsel's table. He was seated at the defense bench, and the entire case would rise or fall on whether a jury believed the story he could no longer keep straight. A case without an eyewitness from the outset. The prosecution acknowledged a weakness that defense attorneys hoped to exploit. No one had seen Alex Murdaugh pull the trigger. There was no surveillance video capturing the shootings, no confession, no forensic evidence that placed the murder weapons directly in his hands. Instead, prosecutors built something far more deliberate. They built a case around context. In modern American criminal trials, juries are often asked to decide not what they saw, but what makes sense. The prosecution's task was not to recreate a single moment of violence, but to explain why all other explanations failed. Reconstructing the night, the state began where the defense hoped they would not time. Jurors were walked minute by minute through the evening of June 7, 2021. Dinner at Moselle, the trip to the kennels, the moment phones went silent, the narrow window during which both Maggie and Paul were killed. There was no speculation. Every step was anchored to data. The prosecution did not tell jurors what to think. They showed them what could not be reconciled: a defendant who insisted he was not present, and digital evidence that placed him there. The Snapchat video. Again, when Paul Murdaugh's Snapchat video was played in court, it was not dramatic in the way television portrays evidence. There was no shocking image, No visible violence, just sound, a man's voice in the background, calm, familiar, undeniably close. Alex Murdaugh's voice. The prosecution did not linger. They did not dramatize. They asked a single question that hung in the air longer than any argument. If the defendant was not there, whose voice is this? The defense had no clean answer. The defense theory, an invisible enemy Alex's attorneys, advanced a theory that the murders were retaliation, an act of revenge, tied to Paul's 2019 boat crash. They argued that enemies existed, that anger festered in the community, and that someone else could have seized the opportunity. But theory requires evidence. No unknown vehicles were recorded entering Moselle. No unfamiliar phones appeared in location data. No witnesses placed strangers on the property. In contrast, the prosecution pointed to one fact that did not require interpretation. Alex Murdaugh lied about where he was. Why the money mattered, one of the most controversial decisions in the trial, was the state's insistence on presenting Alex's financial crimes. The defense objected repeatedly, arguing that theft and addiction did not equal murder. The prosecution agreed. They did not present the financial evidence to show character. They presented it to show pressure. They showed jurors a man whose world was collapsing, a law firm on the verge of discovery, a civil case demanding financial transparency, an addiction draining resources faster than deception could replace them. Then they asked jurors to consider timing. The murders did not end the problems, but they delayed them. They shifted attention. They bought time. That delay, prosecutors argued, was motive. The decision to testify against the advice of many legal observers, Alex Murdaugh took the stand. It was a gamble rooted in confidence, the same confidence that had carried him through decades of influence. He admitted to lying. He admitted to stealing. He admitted to addiction. But he denied murder. The defense strategy was clear. Portray Alex as deeply flawed, but incapable of killing his own family. Instead, the testimony created a new problem. Jurors watched a man explain lie after lie after lie while asking them to believe him on the only question that mattered. Credibility, once lost, rarely returns. Cross-examination on cross. Prosecutors did not raise their voices. They did not accuse. They simply returned to the facts. You said you were not at the kennels. The video says otherwise. You said you do not remember, but you remember enough to deny involvement. Each question narrowed the space between denial and disbelief. By the time Alex stepped down, the room had changed. The trial was no longer about whether the prosecution could prove its case. It was about whether the defense could undo what had already been shown. Closing arguments in closing, the prosecution avoided emotion. They did not ask jurors to imagine the fear of the victims or the horror of the act. They asked them to consider logic. No intruders, no evidence of outsiders. One man at the scene who lied about being there. One man under crushing pressure. One man whose behavior after the murders showed a willingness to stage violence to escape consequences. They did not ask the jury to understand the act. They asked them to recognize it. The verdict, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, there was no suspense in their faces. Guilty on all counts. Alex Murdaugh showed no visible reaction. The courtroom remained quiet. The dynasty that had shaped the region's justice system for generations ended not with chaos, but with certainty. Where the story goes next, the verdict answered the legal question. It did not answer the cultural one. How did this happen? How did this happen? How did a system allow so much to go unchecked for so long? And what happens after the most powerful family in the region is stripped of its shield? Those questions would define the final chapter. After the verdict, what justice leaves behind the verdict closed the case. It did not close the story. When Alex Murdaugh stood before the judge for sentencing, the courtroom no longer carried the tension of uncertainty. Guilt had already been decided. What remained was consequence and reflection. The sentence was life in prison, without the possibility of parole. No dramatic outburst followed. No public reckoning in the moment. Just the steady confirmation that a man who once operated comfortably above the system would now live entirely within it. For the law, the case was finished. For the community, it was only beginning to understand what had happened. Sentencing and silence at sentencing, the judge spoke directly to Alex Murdaugh about credibility, about lies layered upon lies, about the calculated nature of the crime. It was a rebuke not only of the murders, but of the belief that intelligence and influence could outmaneuver truth. Alex spoke briefly. He maintained his innocence. He expressed love for his family. His words changed nothing. In the end, there was no grand speech, no last-minute reversal, just a man escorted out of a courtroom he once dominated. The silence that followed felt permanent. Moselle, empty Moselle did not become a shrine. It became something quieter. The hunting estate, once a symbol of comfort, power, and inherited authority, stood vacant. The kennels where Maggie and Paul died were no longer part of daily life. The land returned to what it had always been beneath the image, isolated, still, and indifferent. For locals, Moselle became a reference point, not a destination, a reminder. Power had lived there, and power had failed. Life after the name in prison, Alex Murdaugh became what the justice system ultimately reduces everyone to: an inmate number, a routine, a sentence measured in years that will never end. But the collapse did not stop with him. Civil cases moved forward. Financial judgments were entered. Victims of his fraud, many of whom had waited years, finally saw acknowledgment, if not full restitution. The wealth that once protected the family evaporated under scrutiny. The Murdaugh name, once an asset, became a liability. Reopened questions after the verdict, investigators quietly revisited old files, not because they believed Alex could be charged again for murder, but because the case had revealed how easily certain questions had once been dismissed. Deaths ruled accidental. Investigations concluded quickly. Decisions made without challenge. No sweeping conspiracy was uncovered. No hidden list of crimes tied neatly together. What emerged instead was something more uncomfortable: a pattern of deference. Cases involving powerful families had been handled differently, not illegally on their face, but without the rigor applied elsewhere. The Murdaugh case forced law enforcement and prosecutors to acknowledge that truth. Sometimes injustice is not committed loudly. Sometimes it is permitted silently. Systems under review in the months that followed, South Carolina officials reviewed procedures that relied too heavily on reputation and personal relationships. Financial oversight of attorneys tightened. Conflicts of interest received renewed attention. Independence, long assumed, was re-examined. No reform erased the past, but the illusion that the system was immune to influence did not survive. That mattered. The victims beyond the headlines, Maggie and Paul Murdaugh, were not symbols. They were people. Their deaths became a spectacle, but their lives existed outside it. The same was true for the many clients. Alex defrauded people whose losses never made national news, but whose lives were altered all the same. Justice in this case did not restore what was taken. It stopped the taking. Why this case held the country America did not fixate on this story because of its violence alone. It fixated because the case challenged a belief many quietly hold. That power, if concentrated long enough, becomes untouchable. The Murdaugh case proved something else. Power can delay accountability. It can complicate it, but it cannot erase evidence. Phones remember. Records persist. Data accumulates. And eventually, even the most insulated systems are forced to confront what they allowed. The final lesson from an investigative standpoint, the Murdaugh murders reaffirmed an old truth. Crimes like this rarely collapse under a single revelation. They fall apart through accumulation, small contradictions, overlooked details. Moments when a story stops aligning with reality. The most dangerous offender is not the stranger in the dark. It is the trusted figure operating in plain sight. Closing 2 lives were lost at Moselle. A dynasty ended in a courtroom, and a community was left to rebuild its faith in a system that had failed to question itself. Justice did not arrive quickly. It did not arrive cleanly, but it arrived, and in doing so, it left behind a warning that extends far beyond South Carolina. No name is larger than the truth, and no system can outrun it forever.